Welcome to the Closer Look for the 6th of December 2023 as part of the Knightsbridge Research Global Hotspot Briefing. This is part two of our after action review of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive. And as we work through this agenda in three parts, we're now getting into the thick of it. With our overview of the offensive. So I do hope that you are enjoying that. As mentioned last week, this closer look, this series of closer looks is being brought to you by a guest contributor, Joshua Stevens. This is the same analyst who brought you the Emerging Military Tactics in Ukraine three-part series in summer of 2023 that we presented to our subscribers. So we do hope that you enjoy that series and are enjoying this series as well. Josh spent a lot of time overseas, as you can see here in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's now a small business owner at tfirearms.com, and we certainly appreciate his insights. With that, let's jump back into it and get to part two of this Closer Look series.
Now up towards the east, tons of fighting. So Bakhmut started out as a hotspot. It was a hotspot before the offensive, and it remained a hotspot kind of throughout. And you can see this map demonstrates fairly thoroughly the crisscrossing of rail lines, and the rail lines were the stated reason for the Russian push into Bakhmut. And you can see Ukrainian forces made some progress, but not a whole lot of progress in getting back to those rail lines. And there was especially near Kalishnikov, they had almost breached. And I believe Knightsbridge did some reporting where they're like, hey, it looks like it might happen, but they're still being held at these lines. They're still being held at these lines. And every time they got close to rail lines, Russia would shift their forces around. They would recommit. They were using their VDV specifically as something of a quick reactionary force. And you could kind of tell, especially towards the end of, or the later stages of the Ukrainian offensive, where Russia was concerned, because that's where they pushed the VDV to. And anywhere VDV was popping up, you were seeing Ukrainian offensive stall and lines get shored up and more forces shuffled. And then eventually you started seeing these counters. And Avivdika, that was and remains kind of one of the big pushes for Russia right now, countering the Ukrainian offense. And I really enjoyed Knightsbridge's reporting on the counteroffense, the limited, and I hesitate to call it a counteroffense, but the limited counterattacks that Russia's been doing down in Avivka, where I've attempted to encircle the forces there, and VDV got pushed up there, and then VDV got not resupplied, but plussed up by more conventional Russian forces and even some of the new recruits, which was really interesting. And it almost looked like Russia was going to be launching their winter offensive early. It was right as everything popped off in Gaza with Israel. We saw this huge concentrated effort by Russia to really start. And you can see, I like this map a lot because you got these two pincers coming in where they're trying to encircle Avivka, and you can see the rail lines there, and that's why it's important. Is you got that critical rail juncture there, you've got all these rail lines behind it, and it would shore up an important logistical line in the area and make further gains a lot easier. The issue is it's a massive city, and there's just urban conflict is by nature very gruesome and very brutal, and it requires well-trained troops on the ground to be successful with it. You can bomb everything to pieces, you can run tanks through it, but eventually you've got to go clear the rubble. And if you don't know what you're doing, clearing the rubble is extraordinarily difficult. And there was one of the issues the U.S. military struggled with in the battles of Fallujah, is eventually we had to send people in and we had to go clear the houses individually. And it's just, if clearing houses, it's mind-numbing work, and you have to be at the top peak of your game to do it successfully, and it is very, very quickly able to exhaust you in every aspect, because there's so much that goes into doing it successfully. And it's one of the reasons why it's generally, especially for attacking forces, very bloody, which is what the Russians have been discovering. So they pushed their forces into them. A lot of them were new recruits, and Russia's been recruiting heavily. I believe you guys have been reporting that they've been recruiting pretty heavily for like the last 4 to 6 months. It's been something that's been going on for quite some time. And other intelligence agencies and news agencies have been reporting similar, hey, there's this weird draft going on. Hey, there's this stuff going on. And generally speaking, modern militaries assume a recruit will take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to become, your average dude off the streets to a trained soldier that's ready to go into combat. And so we're seeing that timeline kind of start to come to its fruition. Now, what Russia has been doing, which is not necessarily unique, but it's a big departure from what they did last year, is they have been taking these new recruits and they have been integrating them slowly with frontline forces. So instead of what they did last year, where they said, hey, all you new guys, you're going in Volodar, have fun, don't die. And they died. And now what we're seeing is they're taking these seasoned units and they're interspersing these new recruits into these seasoned units so that they can get experience on the line. But they're not doing it to the front guys that are pushing. They're doing it to your not rear echelon guys, but your guys that are running your defenses. So they're getting used to and they're getting exposure to combat without necessarily being in extreme danger. Yes, it's still dangerous because it is a frontline situation, but there's a lot of, they call it the soldier's sixth sense, but there's a lot of stuff that can contribute to survival on the battlefield that isn't necessarily trainable. It's something innate. It's something you discover. It's something that's almost primal. It's in your gut. And the United States Marine Corps, they've got their left of bang program where they try to dig into, hey, what are these unquantifiable things that somehow make this guy better able to survive than this guy that we can't teach them? And what's neat is, or I guess what's interesting is, we're seeing Russia try to figure out a way to instill that, hey, if you hear a gunshot that sounds like this, that means duck. If you hear a boom that sounds like that, that means dive for cover. If you hear a whistle that sounds like that, don't worry about it, shoot back. And all of that stuff, you can't figure out until it's happened. Like you don't know what a bullet sounds like when it's 12 feet away versus what it sounds like when it's right here, unless it's happened to you. People can explain it and you can kind of wrap your mind around it, but until you've experienced it, you don't really know. And so much of that stuff is instinctual. You have to react now, you can't react later. That the only way to really figure it out is by exposure to it. And we used to, in the United States military, we would do what we called our RIPS, or our right seat, left seat, where you'd have your experienced guys that have been in a place for anywhere from 12 to 18 months and your brand new guys, and they'd be going on missions together. And this guy would be saying, hey, man, if you see this, don't do this. And you were building that experience. And normally we would do what we call milk runs. You'd be running your logistic resupply stuff and organizing the new guys stuff in with the old guys stuff and switching things out and replacing with worn equipment, things like that. Lower risk operations. And it would try to just build that familiarity with the area, build that familiarity with combat for guys that didn't have it, and increase their survivability. And we're seeing that exact thing happen with the Russian forces. However, when everything kicked off with Israel, we saw this huge rush into Avivka. And when that happened, initially everyone was like, "Oh no, it's this counteroffensive that's going on." And I kind of thought the same thing. I was like, "Oh wow, they've decided to go all in early." And I think had they been successful, they would have probably pushed more. But they quickly hit Ukrainian defenses, and they started getting slaughtered. And it was very meat grindery. And what was really fascinating about it, especially compared to last winter's offensive, is they didn't just keep pushing. They didn't exhaust all of the forces like they did in Volodar. They said, oh, wait a second, we're getting slaughtered. Let's wait. Let's build up and we'll go in when we're ready. And that's what we're seeing right now, is almost an operational pause kind of across the front lines. You're still seeing more Russian pressure on the Ukrainians than you had seen in the past, but it's not to the point where they're launching some kind of offensive where they're really aggressively digging in. And on the flip side, you're seeing the Ukrainians really dial back pretty much all of their offenses. And they're doing that in the face of issues with support from the West, as Israel's kind of dividing Western support between Ukraine and Israel. But you're also seeing the human cost of this offensive start to really weigh in, where they don't necessarily have the manpower to keep pushing. And we're starting to see issues like we saw in Bakhmut with the Russians, like we saw during the Russian offensive, where Ukrainian units are refusing to go on missions. And it's interesting. I've seen it happen a couple of times firsthand, where soldiers get to the point where they know for sure if they go and do something, they'll die, and it's not worth it. And they're willing to take whatever repercussions come from the military chain of command, which you're instilled with from day one is, you never refuse orders. It's the worst thing that can possibly happen. Everything you love will be taken from you. And, the Russian military, and I would imagine the Ukrainian military, just because of where they are doctrinally and how they align similarly with Russian training ideology, is, I would assume, very aggressively against disobeying orders. And we're still seeing that happen. And you have to understand the mentality of someone that's saying, I know for sure if I go over there, I'm done for. There's nothing worse than me going over there. I'm not doing it. And it's kind of fascinating to start to see that happening in the Ukrainian military right now. I believe that sums up the Eastern push. Do you have any questions on that one?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the Eastern push is that you this is where you really started to see the Russian military putting new recruits on defense with those experienced troops, like you talked about, and no new recruits on offense. This is
Yes,
where that happened, right? South of Bakhmut, all these areas that you're discussing. And it really signaled, at least from where I sit, a strategy shift being directed by the Kremlin, right? Like, hey,
absolutely.
quit putting our new guys on offense. One,
Yeah,
they're no good at it, right? They're getting eaten alive. But let them learn from the veterans. Let them go on defense for a while, kind of like the milk runs you talked about, right? And the American version of that. But this is where we really saw that happening. And so far, that's been a good move by Russia. They're getting those troops more experienced. They're getting time with experienced troops. They're getting time on defense. They're starting to learn what it's like to be on the battlefield without losing mass numbers, right? Um,
absolutely.
and this is where all that happens. That's kind of my major takeaway from this region south of Bakhmut, is Russia really adjusted their strategies and their tactics here, and it benefited them greatly, especially against Ukraine's counteroffensive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that's kind of fascinating about this is Russian military doctrine. I mean, we have the same issue in the United States military, but to much less of a degree. Russian military doctrine rarely changes. It takes something massive for it to change. And for it to change like this is, if I was a Ukrainian general, it would be something that would be highly concerning to me, because if they're changing on a fundamental level like this, what's it going to mean for offensive operations that they continue to do? And that's something we saw with the offensive in Avivka, where they started taking heavy losses, and everybody, when it first happened, they were like, here we go, same old meat grinder tactics. They're doing it again. They're going to get butchered this winter. And then they stopped. And people
Yes, they
that,
got a little
that,
smarter. They got a little
yeah,
bit smarter. And Russian military doctrine hadn't changed since World War One. But
no, not,
suddenly,
not a bit.
but right, not at all, which was a little bit shocking to all of us, I think. We expected
Yeah,
that in the last, I don't know, multiple decades, that their doctrine would have changed. And
yeah,
early on in this war, they proved that their doctrines hadn't changed at all. But
absolutely.
in this phase, suddenly you see a shift in Russian doctrine where all of
Yeah.
a sudden they are more concerned about human casualties, which I think, from the Russian perspective, bodes well for whatever they have planned in 2024, but we'll get to that a little bit later.
Yes. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide here. So we had the Kharkov Dam. That's another, and I'm going to wade into some controversy here. Another highly controversial action that occurred. So the timing of it, to me, is really kind of coincidental, a little too coincidental. But right as the offensive starts to maybe kind of start, depending on who you believe, the Kharkov Dam gets blown up. To this date, nobody knows who did it. Nobody knows necessarily why it was done. But in my opinion, it's who profits question. One, the fact the timing is very suspicious to me. The fact that this dam blows up right as the Ukrainian offensive starts is very suspicious to me. The fact that this dam blows up and does significant damage to Russian defenses along the left side of the Dnieper River is also very suspicious to me. You would think if the Russians did it, they would have the sense to tell their guys, hey, these defensive positions that you've been preparing for the last couple of months for this Ukrainian offensive, go ahead and let's scooch them back a little bit, or maybe make a second line that we can fall back to. And let's not put all of our guys on that bank because, we're about to blow it up and flood it. However, Russia does have a very bad habit of not informing especially its lower, what we would call lower enlisted in the military, but it's lower level military members, and even higher level military members, something that would be unthinkable in the United States. They don't always inform them of what's going on. So that's where they have a lot of their logistical log jams. And it's one of the reasons why we don't, or we try to avoid doing it as much as we can in the United States military, is we want those low level leaders to be making snap decisions on the fly and supporting the big picture so that everybody's working together towards a goal. Uh, Russian doctrine is, hey, these guys are too stupid. They don't need to know what's going on, which sometimes happens in the US military. But again, doctrinally speaking, we are huge on small unit level leaders leading the fight, being the front of the tip of the spear. And to do that, they have to know where that spear is supposed to be thrusting. So there is a possibility that Russia did this and didn't inform their personnel that it was going to happen, or informed them in such a haphazard manner that it was ineffective. However, to me, it seems highly suspicious that these positions would be almost across the board wiped out by this flooding and nobody knew about it. And again, you can also say, oh, well, it was a surprise thing. They wanted it to look bad. Look, they've tricked Josh with their schemes because, and maybe that's true. But you take the, Occam's razor, the simplest answer, it looks very suspicious. Either way, it doesn't really matter because the facts on the ground are these Russian positions got wiped out when the Kharkov Dam blew up. And this it created the opportunity for Ukrainian forces to cross the Dnieper River, which and depends on who you talk to. Most of the people call it the Dnieper River. Some people call it the Dnieper River, but it is the largest river in Europe. It's massive, and it has been a significant feature in warfare in that area since forever. Everybody talks about the Dnieper. Dnieper is huge. The Dnieper also bisects Ukraine. To be able to put forces on the other side of the Dnieper is one. It's a huge PR victory because it's a big deal. You cross the mighty Dnieper. But it's also a very big military feat. Bridgehead operations are extraordinarily difficult, and a significant number of Russians were wiped out at bridgeheads to the point where they started being heavily targeted by Ukrainian forces because it was such, especially with modern combined arms, such an easy target to take out. And a lot of the early Russian bullets to Kharkov, or excuse me, to Kiev, were thwarted at river crossings because of either poor Russian bridging operations or just due to how good the Ukrainians had gotten at taking out bridgeheads. So when this dam blew and these positions flooded, Ukrainian forces almost immediately started pushing across. Initially, it was Ukrainian special forces, and they were going over and they were conducting small raids. And it was this, make the enemy fear us no matter where they sleep kind of thing. But because the Dnieper was there, the positions were fairly lightly defended. I mean, you don't need to defend anything if you got the biggest river in Europe stopping the other side from going, from coming across. So it was an interesting area to attack. And it allowed Ukraine to get these small footholds. And initially they were taking over these little, what they call deltas, but they're islands in the middle of this river. and they would take them and then they would leapfrog across those and they would start raiding these beach areas. Now, over the last couple of months, especially most recent months, they've started actually taking ground on the left side of the Dnieper River bank or on the southern southeastern side, depending on how you want to look at the map. From those positions that they've taken, they've started, pushing into other areas and threatening more logistics and kind of being more of a boogeyman in the night than an actual occupying force. The issue is they're not able to actually hold ground over there without armored assets. And so they've attempted to make a couple bridgehead operations, and they've all been thwarted by Ukrainian forces because the second they start actually massing forces and creating viable targets, drones and artillery target them, take them out, and then they're back to square one. So you're still seeing, and now it's special forces and Ukrainian Marines are going across and taking these footholds, seizing ground, causing all of, not, I hesitate to say terror because it is kind of occupied territory, but they're making people fearful. You can't rest easy. We're here, kind of thing. However, the lack of Russian response in the area, one, shows how little they care about it, but also how little of a tactical priority it is. Russia's not planning on crossing the Dnieper, so there's no reason really for them to have these massive strongholds here. Therefore, there's no reason for them to commit forces to push out these special forces that are just going to pop back up again anyway. However, Ukraine, and I suspect this is why we're seeing an increased focus on this area, especially with the offensive winding down. This is still one of the few areas where we're seeing Ukraine take offensive action. And I think it is because they know Russia doesn't really care about it. And it looks great in the media. Oh, look, we pushed into another village on the other side of the Dnieper. They can't stop us. Nothing will stop us. The river can't stop us. Russia can't stop us. We're still waging an offensive campaign. And so it's really interesting to see. And I think this is what most likely is going to, or what the Ukrainian offensive is most likely going to devolve into, are these raids and these symbolic kind of propaganda victories as opposed to actually taking ground. That
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
covers this
I
front.
think
Yeah,
I think that's a great point because what we're seeing right now out of Ukraine is that they're crossing the river, like you said, raids more or less, but
yeah,
they're trumpeting that as some major victory when in reality it's not. And Russia isn't committing additional troops to the Western Front, if you will. They're
yeah,
they're they're continuing to move their troops to the central and eastern sectors, which is
right.
where the next Russian offensive is likely to come, and also where Ukraine's main attempts have been. So Ukraine
Absolutely.
crossing the river, yeah, it looks great when Zelensky talks about it, like, hey, we've crossed the river, we've taken 7 settlements, whatever. But in
Yeah,
reality, I think both sides know that this is a sideshow, right? That Ukraine's
I
not going
agree.
to actually take, even though Russia doesn't have a lot of troops in the area,
Yeah,
Ukraine isn't going to really be able to take much because, it still is a muddy mess, right? In
yes,
the southern Dnipro area. It still is very difficult to cross.
yeah,
Ukraine cannot land mass troops. They cannot transfer a lot of heavy equipment, tanks,
no,
APCs, etc., across that river. So it is something of a sideshow. And I
yeah.
think everyone realizes that at this point, which means that it's likely to probably come to a conclusion at some point soon. Do you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. I think it's political theater that's involving military forces, but I 100% agree with you. I think this is kind of the dying gasps of the Ukrainian offensive.
Yep. Awesome. I'm glad
Yep.
we agree.
Absolutely. So, and that kind of brings us to our conclusion here. We've got our our map on June 1st, which is around when everybody kind of agrees that okay, yeah, we started seeing actual concentrated efforts to push into Russian held territory and take Russian held territory. And again, remember the original stated goals and intentions of this offensive was they were going to push Russia back to the Azov, which is over there on the eastern side of Melitopol and Mariupol, and they were going to occupy Crimea. Not necessarily take Crimea, but they were going to put forces in Crimea. And so if we go over here to our map on November 18th, which was just a couple of days ago, you have to really, really look close. And you can see there's some blue dots there. And that's what they achieved with their summer offensive. And it really, a lot of times you'll see, depending on the media source that's reporting, and you and I, we've talked about it quite frequently. The most frustrating aspect of this conflict is how hard it is to find accurate information because everyone is so biased. You're either reading, or a Russian media source that says we're winning, they're all dead, Zelensky's surrendering tomorrow, or you're reading a Western report that says, hey, look at this tiny, tiny map, see how many gains have been made. And it's very difficult to figure out exactly what's going on given how biased everyone is. But if you look at this map, it really paints a stark picture of how minuscule the Ukrainian gains over their summer offensive have been. And it's for me, if I was a Ukrainian soldier, it would be extremely sobering and extraordinarily frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that completely. Maps cut through the noise, right?
Absolutely.
So you see the propaganda out of either side, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of kind of where you sit on this conflict, you can look at maps and you can see from June 1st to November 18th, which is, like you said, arguably the beginning and the end of this
Yeah.
counteroffensive. And you're hard pressed to see any changes, right?
Yeah.
And so
100%.
when you really boil it down on that level, that's why we wanted to do this series of closer looks and kind of dissect what went wrong for Ukraine, because
Yeah.
this really heavily promoted counteroffensive from June to November gained you
Yeah.
basically nothing when you look at the maps, right? And
Yeah.
ISW is a good source, right? That ISW
Yes.
does great work. Um,
Yeah.
this is not
And I mean, for the record,
propaganda. This is
ISW,
not propaganda from ISW, right? This
no.
is verified, controlled
Yeah.
terrain
Well, and
coming out of
what's unique
ISW.
about this
So
is ISW, if you really look at their reporting, they tend to lean, and they're fairly unbiased, but they lean towards Ukrainian support. A lot of their
yes,
reporting is more favorable to Ukraine than it is to Russia, and it's because most of their analysts
yes,
are Ukrainian analysts. So for them to come out knowing that they've got a bias that way and put this out, like I said, it's a very stark contrast, and it's a very concerning, or at least it would be to me if I was a Western analyst or a Western politician or in the Ukrainian military or something like that.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got a source that's mostly neutral, but slight
Yeah,
pro-Ukraine bias.
yeah,
And these the maps being put out. And at Knightsbridge, we agree with these maps. I mean, we think these are pretty well spot on.
yeah,
But you've got, just to kind of sum up everything you've been talking about, all of Ukraine's efforts over the summer and fall have led to exactly what you see here on these maps, which is basically
yeah,
nothing.
yep. Which is yeah. I mean, it speaks for itself. There's
Yeah, it really
not a
does.
whole lot
This
else to
is
say.
this is why we wanted this slide in the presentation, right?
Absolutely.
Because nothing provides clarity like maps. And
Yes,
especially when it comes to warfare, like look at the map on the left, look at the map on the right. There's some
absolutely.
extreme clarity there. And
For sure.
that's why I wanted to be sure to get this into this closer look.
Yeah.
And so we're going to pause there for part two of this three-part series on this after-action review of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive. We do hope that you will join us next week as we conclude this series with guest contributor Joshua Stevens. And we hope that this is something that's really valuable to you and gives you a lot of good insights as to what went right and what went wrong during that counteroffensive. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.